This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 545, DKAN. On today's show, we're talking about the open data platform DKAN, what it's used for, and how it applies to Drupal, with our guests, Liz Tupper and Dan Feder. We'll also cover Modern Drupal Dashboard as our module of the week. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Our guests today are Liz Tupper and Dan Feder. Liz Tupper is a strategic technology leader with over 25 years of experience driving transformation change across the civic tech, social good, AI, Internet of Things, web, mobile application, and video game industries. She is the Senior Director of Product at Civic Actions, where she is passionate about making an impact in civic tech, especially using open source technology. Liz, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And Dan is a web developer who has worked at Civic Action since 2017. He has served the public and nonprofit sectors for over 2 decades and is one of the principal maintainers of the DKAN open source data software. He lives in Philadelphia with his wife and son. Dan, welcome to the show, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
I'm John Picozzi, Solutions Architect at EPAM, and today my co-hosts are joining us for the third time, Steve Wirt, tech lead at Civic Actions. He's a backend developer and product caretaker to government websites, Drupal module developer, practicing contrib first. We like that. The first robotics team mentor, and a builder of odd furniture and other woodworky things. Steve, I don't even know what to do with all those things. It seems like you're doing so much, building furniture, building robots, building open source. My gosh. Thanks for joining us. And
thanks for having me.
Regular listeners might be noticing that we're kind of like mixing things up a little bit. This is actually going to be Steve's 4th show, but in the 3rd show spot, because next week we'll be recording our live DrupalCon show, right? So listeners, look forward to that one. You'll also notice maybe that in our other guest host spot today is Martin Anderson Klutz. Martin Anderson Klutz, product marketing manager for Drupal at Acquia. There we go.
Happy to be here.
And yes, Martin is filling in for Nick today as he is powerless to join us. Ba-dum-bum. All right. Let's actually just turn it right over to Martin for our module of the week. What do you got for us this week, Martin?
Thanks, John. Have you ever wanted to have your Drupal site admins start with a fast widget-based interface that surfaces key site metrics, system health, and operational insights? There's a module for that. It's called Modern Drupal Dashboard, and it was created in February of 2026 by Gaurav Kapoor of Work21 in Berlin. It has a 1.0.5 version available, which works with Drupal core 10.3 and 11. It is actively maintained and has security coverage and has no open issues and is officially in use by 4 sites according to Drupal.org. Now, with the module installed, site visitors with the new Access Modern Dashboard permission can access a React-based dashboard with widgets to provide insights on topics like content overview to see total content count, published versus unpublished, and per content type background, a users overview to see user count per role, including users with multiple roles counted in each role, plus pie chart visualization, additional content listing all entity types, showing counts and providing direct manage links, a modules overview indicating installed modules summary, including enabled or disabled and core or contrib breakdown, a system and status summary, including key environment details like Drupal core version, PHP version, and database information, as well as health checks, including a Drupal requirement check grouped by status, sort of pass, warning, or error, with a dedicated detail view. Now, each widget can be clicked to open a detailed view, including the extended data, making it easy for admins to dig into any specific area of interest. The widget-based architecture should also help to pull in data from other sources, potentially including other things like analytics as well. But let's talk about Modern Drupal Dashboard.
I took a quick look at it this morning, and I like the look and feel of it. It has a nice appearance to the dashboard, gives you what you need to know.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I feel like everybody wants a dashboard. Every time I hear about like, oh, user needs to log in, admin needs to log in, they need a dashboard. So, the fact that this is in existence is interesting. And it's interesting because to me also because it says it's a dashboard for Drupal 11, but it supports, looks like it supports 10.3 and above. So you can also get it on your Drupal 10 site.
Yeah, I think the Drupal 10.3 compatibility was kind of recently added. So probably maybe the product page needs to be updated to reflect that. I do think it's interesting as well, considering Drupal CMS2 includes dashboard using a different project. So the dashboard project. So it's kind of interesting, we sort of have a growing number of options in this space, but it is interesting to see this as specifically a React-based approach to providing that dashboard. And would be interesting to see if there was some way for some of these competing solutions to maybe at like kind of an API layer have some commonality. So, one given plugin could be written that could support either display using a React widget in one ecosystem or displayed in more of a native Drupal interface in another. I don't know if that's possible, but it would be interesting if some of the people behind some of these different solutions could maybe compare notes on some of those ideas.
Now, you made it sound like it was slightly customizable where you could probably build your own widgets to kind of plug and play into this. Is that true, or did I just kind of fabricate that?
Yeah, so the module does include kind of a base class that you can use to sort of extend and create custom widgets if you wanted to have some kind of, let's say, CRM display, or, I think analytics is a thing I've heard a lot of, people looking at Drupal as a CMS ask about. So I think the degree to which you can make Drupal the glass for things that are not just about sort of managing content, but other kinds of ways that people evaluate the success of a website, being able to pull all of those into Drupal and have it sort of that single source of truth for all kinds of ways that people might evaluate the success of their website would definitely be helpful.
Not to shift focus from our module of the week this week, but have you seen a module that allows for kind of providing that analytics widget? Did we do a previous module? Am I remembering correctly that provides that analytics data back to Drupal in a widget form?
So there is a dashboard module that does that. I can't remember if it's the one that's in Drupal CMS or a different one that I have used over the years, but I definitely know there is one that, if I recall correctly, works with blocks. And because there's like a Google Analytics reporting module that provides a block, then you can sort of drop that into your dashboard. It's maybe also worth mentioning, while we're sort of broadening our discussion to include sort of dashboards in general, the Homebox dashboard module is one that a lot of people will be familiar with because it's sort of how on Drupal.org people can customize their own little dashboard to include whichever widgets are sort of meaningful for them. So if your website needs kind of more that individually configurable dashboard, then Homebox could also be one to check out.
All right.
It does seem like there's a handful of things competing for the space, and I like your comments, Martin, about how like bringing them together more. Like when I first looked at it, I was thinking about like my documentation module that has a bunch of reports. Will Jackson's got an audit export module that does a bunch of reporting, and it's like, if we were all collaborating a little bit more and connecting the dots instead of having like 3 or 4 competing products, if they were blended together, I think that'd be great.
Yes, I agree with that statement 150 to 200%. I do often feel like we need to combine our efforts into some of these solutions to kind of unify things. But hey, we can all agree everybody needs a good dashboard, right? Martin, thanks for bringing us a great module of the week. If folks wanted to get a hold of you to suggest a module or just talk about modules in general, how could they best do that?
We're always happy to talk about candidates for module of the week in the Talking Drupal channel of Drupal Slack, or people can reach out to me directly as ManClue on a variety of Drupal and social channels.
Or if you happen to be at DrupalCon this week, I'm sure Martin will be around for you to talk modules with.
Yeah, I expect to be in the Acquia booth during a lot of the breaks. So if folks want to stop by and chat, would love to talk about modules of the week.
Did I not to go down the rabbit hole of DrupalCon booths, but did I hear that Acquia is doing some sort of beach theme this year? Was that accurate, or am I making that up again?
Yeah, tiki theme. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I look forward to it. I'm always interested by the Acquia booth. All right, let's jump into our site content. Oh boy, our show content today. And Liz, I'm gonna point the first question to you because I'm not overly familiar, and I'm sure maybe many of our listeners are not overly familiar or maybe new to it. But what exactly is DKAN, and what problem does it solve?
Yeah. For this question, I'll start with just like a brief summary about DKAN, but then we need to step back and talk a little bit more about open data, and then we can come back to the discussion around DKAN. But essentially, DKAN is a free open source data catalog built on Drupal. It helps governments and organizations publish and manage open data. And if we take the step back about open data, since around like early 2010s, many governments have required open data. So basically the idea is when government creates data, it should belong to the public. And so, the open data, it takes aim at taking information that's either hidden or really hard to access in private databases or spreadsheets, and makes it easy for anyone to find and use that data, having it be searchable by keyword, date, agency, and just the list goes on from there. And you can think of open data like open source software, but for data sets. So this means, publishing data in open formats like CSV or XML and under open licenses such as Creative Commons. And so to get back to DKAN, DKAN lets you build an open data catalog. Sometimes, it'll be called a portal or a repository in Drupal. The name really reflects its inspiration from CKAN, which is an influential and popular open source Python data catalog. And, while many governments have chosen to use centralized or proprietary software like Socrata to power their open data programs, we believe tools should be open as well. And that's why DKAN exists. So really the bottom line is DKAN makes it easy to publish and share data, and just easy to find and download and use data.
So I'm going to try to explain this back to you like I'm a fifth grader to see if I got it. So open data is great. Well,
Yes.
Big fan, right? So like, I don't know, let's like use a big data set, like the census data, right? They collect census data, they publish it, people can access it and use it for all sorts of good things, right? So they may use something like DKAN as a piece of software that basically provides them with a framework to publish that data on the internet.
Correct. Yep.
Yes.
You
right.
got it.
Smart 5-year-old.
I'm taking the rest of the show off, guys. I've gotten it. Okay, so that's cool, and I'm sure as we ask more questions, we'll get into how it connects to Drupal. But I think listeners right now are probably thinking like, I can kind of see where they're going with this because Drupal's structure of content might lend itself very well to that.
Yes, 100%.
So Liz, you mentioned government, but are there other kinds of organizations that use DKAN, and maybe what are some of the common use cases?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, DKAN is mainly used by government. So think about government, not only like at the federal level, but also state and local. Nonprofits and NGOs, also want to share data with the public too. So those are some common use cases. So like sort of like our two major varieties of open data, organizations. So, there's government data. So like those are agencies sharing information with the public because they're either required to or they want to, right? Like they want to be open to their constituents. Another, great variety is research data. So data that's like, used for publishing studies and sharing findings for academic purposes or for research purposes. And so some like common examples that you can think of like city data, so traffic data, transit data, crime data, fire data, so like public works related type data, public health data is another great example. And like, there can also be like environmental data, ocean data, oceanographic data could be another example. So like if you think more broadly, but then there's also these very specific use cases as well. And DKAN's really built for government data. That was sort of our intended use case, which really makes it more straightforward. Research data, there's a lot of great benefits to using DKAN. It is more complex because there's more rules, there's more software integrations that can be clunkier, but many research organizations still use DKAN and CKAN for research because of that flexibility piece. So especially with like the Drupal customizations, Oak Ridge National Labs, which is out of the Department of Energy, uses DKAN in this way for their Constellation data portal. So it's like terabytes of data. It's peer-reviewed data that they're then sharing out to their users. So that's one, specific research example.
Interesting. So I'm wondering, you talked about government, you talked about kind of like educational research kind of facilities, right? I'm wondering, do you see any corporate users of DKAN? Like, are they using it for like their like corporate social responsibility data or their like environmental impact data or stuff like that? Like any use cases there, or are they just like using whatever web software they're currently using for that?
Yeah, so we haven't seen a ton of that. And the one thing I will say about DKAN is it's better at handling really large data sets. So like in that example of Oak Ridge, like that's terabytes of data. There's a lot of other, open data tools that can handle smaller data sets. The great benefit with DKAN and Drupal is like all this taxonomy, filtering and searching, the additional sort of like governance and user roles and everything on the publishing flow. So like and Dan may disagree with this or Steve might disagree with this, but like I don't think this is a great tool for a small data set. Like maybe if you have many small data sets and you want to aggregate those as sort of like a powerful tool behind this, but this is actually really helping to provide clarity and transparency to find the specific information that you need, whether it's, you're an academic, you're a lawyer, you're a journalist, you're the general public, like, who is ever going to look at this data, find the information that they need in this sort of sea of a data set that might exist.
I disagree slightly in that if you've already got a Drupal site and you've got five data sets you want to share, I think it's still the right tool for the job just because of all the things it can do. Drupal doesn't care that it only has 5 things to play with. Like
that's fair. Yeah. Yeah.
But if you didn't have a Drupal site, then adding the burden of Drupal and all of that to sharing 5 CSVs or something like that, might not be worth it. But if you're already running Drupal, it would be nothing to.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with that statement. If you're already in the Drupal ecosystem, why not? It's there. You might not take advantage of all the tools, but there's no harm in that. But if you're not on Drupal, not planning to get to Drupal, it's probably not the right use case for you.
Or it's the reason to go to Drupal.
Oh, sure.
If I could jump in, I also think, sort of the major thing that DKAN, I might say this, the major thing, there's a lot of, but, a big reason that people use these kinds of portals is about sort of implementing standard metadata schemas. So I could be a good choice for a government, for a corporation that has a bunch of data sets that they want to publish with this specific kind of data metadata. I think we might have seen like a health insurance company randomly use it for something a number of years ago. Don't quote me on that, I guess, except that I just said it. But anyway, I think that use case is more common in a sort of institutional framework where you're like, you're sharing with people that need to cite it in a certain way for a paper, or people that use, data kind of scraping tools, and it's just more common for that to be kind of in the public context.
Dan, you've been hip deep in DKAN and open data for a long time. And like, can you describe sort of the origin story of DKAN and how it first emerged? It's kind of a cool story.
Yeah, the idea first came from the sort of web. This is before my time, so I may not get all the terms right, but there was sort of a web team or technology team at the New York State Senate that was a sort of pioneering office in releasing open data. People don't usually think of the New York State Senate and innovation in the same breath, but there are some exceptions to the rule, and this was sort of a happy story. They looked at some of these new ideas about how you should be publishing data, how you should be licensing it, how you should be making it discoverable, and they kind of set up a one-off kind of view and set of fields and probably some sort of RDF feed at the New York State Senate website, which was already running Drupal. And I think as they saw more of these things, start to roll out across governments around the world, you had a kind of major executive order in 2013 from President Obama instructing federal agencies to sort of standardize around this stuff. We started to see CKAN get really popular for this. And, we love CKAN, where we kind of talk to them about a lot of things and are inspired by their work. But there were a lot of challenges to implementing CKAN for especially smaller governments. It's kind of, especially at the time, I think this has changed a bit, but at the time it really didn't use the kind of stack that people were used to deploying in kind of standard web contexts. And there's just a lot of investment already in Drupal in the public sector, the whole ecosystem of vendors and skills. So a few people that formed, that left the state senate and formed a new company that was called New Civic, said, well, let's build CKAN and Drupal basically, and that's where DKAN came from. At this point, it's pretty different from CKAN, and we're not sort of suggesting that we're a direct port of CKAN anymore, but they have similar origins, and I think the initial version of DKAN definitely resembled CKAN a lot more just visually. So that took off. We had a lot of, this was during this sort of boom in open data where just thousands of these portals were being spun up all over the world. So there was a lot of adoption in those early days. And eventually this company, New Civic, went through a number of acquisitions and mergers and kind of got spun down eventually. But Civic Actions decided to take over the stewardship of DKAN as a project in 2017. And myself and Jeanette Day, who had been working at New Civic for a long time on this, came on board shortly after that. And we've been maintaining it at Civic Actions ever since.
So I may have missed this, or we might not have said it, but what does DKAN stand for?
Well, it sort of stands for CKAN in Drupal, but CKAN stands for a Comprehensive Knowledge Archive Network. So it's a little bit of a backronym or something. We don't really spell it out that often.
So it's
at
just
CKAN,
Drupal comprehensive.
Yeah. And there's been I think a JCAN and a couple of other kind of riffs on CKAN because CKAN is so known and influential in that space.
Got it. So we talked a little bit, and I think Liz mentioned this a little bit about kind of the capabilities of Drupal that are useful in DKAN, and I think we're taxonomy users. I'm just wondering, Dan, like, can we go into a little bit more detail on that? Like, I think regular listeners are going to understand, like, yes, Drupal is a good use case for this, but I'm just curious specifically, like, what features is DKAN really leveraging out of Drupal?
Well, I think the biggest things are kind of obvious, right? I mean, the basics of a content management system are already there. We don't have to reinvent the wheel on user authentication and granular permissions. There's this huge ecosystem of modules out there that, you can never really have this one size fits all kind of solution that's going to be right for every use case is going to be very different. You're going to have a research institute that, people have their academic single sign-on that they need to use. You have a government where, I don't know, there's some kind of other standards that they need to meet, or a piv card log, and whatever it is, Drupal is modular, and because it has such a large footprint in government and academia, a lot of these problems are already solved. And then, yeah, in addition to that, this whole system of entities and schemas and all these things, there's a lot of things already there in Drupal that you don't have to reinvent the wheel for.
What are some, I guess, common like integrations that you see when people are using like DKAN? Obviously the SSO and the like the institutional login piece makes sense, but I'm wondering, are there other integrations, other, like, I don't know, modules that are installed that you're seeing?
Let me think. I mean, when we talk about integrations with DKAN, we talk about it in different directions. DKAN's very sort of API first. It has its own kind of RESTful API that actually circumvents the core REST stuff and implements, its own routes and things like that. And it's really meant to power a lot of decoupled front end kinds of things, because so many people are doing data visualizations and kind of complicated searches that just work better as custom front end stuff. In terms of like integrations on the back end, I mean, I would say the biggest thing is workflow. There's a lot of very kind of use case specific requirements around, okay, well, this data set, this person, this class of user role should have permission to create a data set, but they can't publish it. And this other type of role, like sort of a curator role, needs to review and approve it. So even though, DKAN doesn't have any of that stuff in its core code base, we've seen different ways of integrating the data set entity with, Drupal workflow and moderation, content moderation.
So
Using
I
other
heard
powers
that,
in Drupal to like power it to send out notifications, things like that is also really helpful.
so I mean, I guess maybe extending that a little bit, does DKAN have any integrations with some of the more modern tools in Drupal like ECA?
No, I don't. I think it's possible, but to be honest, that's not something. I don't know. Steve might have more of an idea than me how that might happen, but not in my experience.
It has a lot of events that can be subscribed to, so it's easy for other modules to, custom modules to kind of hook into it and pull out what's needed in terms of actions and that kind of thing. But no, it hasn't been brought up to speed with ECA yet.
Interesting. Now, I heard that DKAN started as a Drupal distribution. So is that true? Is it still a distro? And has there been any talk about maybe upgrading it to be something like a recipe or even a site template?
Well, the stories are true. It was a distribution in its first release, which has been required some finagling on the Drupal.org side to sort of migrate it, because it's now in its Drupal 8, incarnation. It is just a module that lives at that level. But in Drupal 7, we were focused more on this sort of turnkey out of the box solution. And, there was just a whole different world back then. We didn't have Composer. We didn't have a lot of the CI/CD stuff. It was just very hard to sort of manage a group of modules that were composed together in a lot of different ways. So, a lot of that stuff is just redundant now. I think the community has basically moved on from distributions, as have we, and more focused on things that are composable and more flexible. So I think there are some things that would make DKAN a little bit more play a little bit better with recipes, but in general, DKAN is more focused on doing a few things very well, and could obviously be part of a larger recipe. Like, I don't know, if you had a academic website recipe, it could be part of that to add a data repository.
Yeah, I wonder if the team that works on local gov has ever thought about having kind of like a DKAN recipe that could sort of drop into those kinds of websites.
That's a great idea.
We should chat about that, yeah. And we'll get to this. There have been some some things about the way DKAN is packaged that have probably also been a little bit of a barrier to that, but that is hopefully changing very soon as we move to Drupal.org for our releases.
DKAN 2 release was a major rebuild. What were the biggest challenges that you encountered and the biggest changes that were made?
Right. So in 2020, we started sort of a ground up rebuild, and we kind of broke and rebuilt everything. There were a lot of things that we really struggled with in the Drupal 7 version that we kind of wanted to just reimagine and focus on sort of getting right. And the biggest change, which is kind of a a challenging thing, I think, for some people to adapt to when they use DKAN, is that we essentially abandoned the fields API for content storage. I mean, we have a field that's called JSON metadata in the kind of core DKAN entity, but we had so many problems, in sort of real world use of these really complicated metadata schemas for open data portals in implementing them as individual fields, because these tend to be very sort of nested, complex, repeating kinds of sets of fields where you might have, one field that contains a group of 8 fields that could repeat and themselves have children. And I think even today, with sort of the latest approaches to this, it's very hard to to manage this with like field. I might not be up on the latest things, but you've had field groups and paragraphs and all these things, but you inevitably have sort of a mess. That's probably not fair, but you have a lot of entity relationships and things to keep in sync, whereas we have this thing called JSON that just you nest it as much as you want, and PHP and MySQL and all the sort of tools in the stack support it very well natively. So we decided, and I should say, in addition to that, there's a performance issue where in some of the operations you want to do on the data portal, you might need to update dozens or hundreds of records at once. And when that means, making joins across 25 tables, because that's the way that your content is structured, we were sometimes waiting for hours for certain things to complete. And switching to one field has, made the equivalent operation take seconds. So there's a lot of challenges. I have to recognize it's a deal breaker for some people that there isn't just a set of fields they can move around in the Fields UI, but it has enabled a lot of really powerful functionality. So that was just one point on my list, but that was a really big thing to sort of rebuild and imagine the system based on JSON to sort of store the different fields. And that required creating, an interface for that. So we have this submodule, which has just been released as its own module called JSON form widget. And that's a form widget, that you can assign to a text field in the Drupal field API that sort of takes a JSON schema and builds an entire form from it. So if your JSON schema is properly composed, and you can add a little bit of config to it to say, well, actually, I want this to be an autocomplete or whatever, and you get a full form, you submit the form, and it's stored as JSON. So those, I mean, that was quite a lot. It probably took us a good year between starting and having a usable release, but we've been at it, now for 6 years, and it gets better and better. There's a couple more things I could probably mention. We kind of started using the Drupal queue system heavily. A lot of these operations take a long time. It's not a good combination with something that is just a request and a response. So rather than having, an API request or a submit or a drush command that just hangs for 10 minutes, it adds it to a queue, and it kind of, happens in the background on a cron run. That's been really powerful. And I think probably the last thing I'll mention is that we built the whole thing API first. So before we even started to think about how the backend UI would work, we, put it all together with an API, basically because we did it the opposite way last time and felt like we were always catching up, like the API was always behind what it could actually do. And it's been much easier to make it make the software do what you want and then create the UI for it. I think that's sort of a more sustainable modern approach.
I have so many questions right now.
Sorry, I know that was a lot.
No. That was all great, but I feel like a little bit of a data dum-dum because I kind of was like coming at this thinking like some poor guy was like sitting there typing their data into Drupal. Liz, I'm wondering like when you see people use DKAN, right? Like how are they typically using it? Is it like, here's all my data in this like spreadsheet that's like, 100,000 lines? Or is it, as Dan was just talking about, is it like, hey, there's a JSON file that has all my stuff in it? Like, I guess what I'm asking is like, you install DKAN, right? Then what? Like, are you uploading a CSV? Are you typing it in manually? Like,
Yeah.
what does that look like?
So it kind of depends on what your use case is and where
Mhm.
your data actually lives. And we find that sometimes even within an organization or an agency, different teams might have different processes too.
Sure.
So like it's really sort of understanding for the data publisher, where are they getting their data from? In some
Mhm.
cases, right, we've got people going into Drupal and then
Mhm.
going into our DKAN module and uploading a file, right?
Mhm.
And then they can go ahead and they can add specific information about the file as well. In other cases, we have people, running the API on their own. And then in some cases too, we have like, and especially for like large files, we have like a folder and then the folder is running some queries to pull that in so they don't have
Got
to
it.
log into DKAN. But those are like some of the more common things that we
Mhm.
see. But like there is some uniqueness to an organization and what type of data we're actually talking about and who needs to publish and how frequently they need to
Mhm.
publish as well. And then sometimes within an agency, it could be multiple scenarios. And Dan, you might be able to like speak more depth around that too, but like, some of the more recent things I've seen over the years tend to fall into those three buckets.
Yeah, it makes me realize we maybe should have given a more kind of clear, like a more specific outline of what a data catalog consists of. I mean, it's a set of records that we call data sets.
Mhm.
You could think of each one of those as, like a block, that's sort of the basic entity type is a data set. And the data set entity describes, this gets a little bit difficult sometimes for people, but the dataset entity describes the dataset. So the data itself is usually a file, like ideally a CSV file. That's the absolute easiest thing to work with, but it might be a zip of a bunch of XML files. It might be, in the research field, you can see some really, I think once working with Oak Ridge, one of the data sets was like 2000 TIFF files in a directory somewhere. So it could be anything. CSV files you can do a lot more with than anything else, but the data set is kind of a wrapper in that way around the file, or it could be multiple files. So the data set will, it's the reason we did it the first time with the content, field API, is it is at the end of the day just a set of fields that someone
Sure.
else has said, you need to tell me when it was published. You need to tell me, what language it's in. You need to tell me what the file format is. You need to tell me what the geospatial boundaries of it are. This is a data set about Alaska. So here's a, set of points that surround where there's a lot, there's a lot of them are optional, but the data standards have like a lot of things a lot of fields that have evolved over time as like a standard way to describe a data set. So that's what we're talking about. And it's true, there are government agencies, especially in the early days, that would hand type a JSON file and then look for software that could sort of ingest that, almost like an RSS feed.
So if somebody has a data set in a CSV file, right? That CSV file, like just as an example, could contain like, 1,000 data points, right? So I'm trying to like in my brain Drupalize this, right? So like your data set entity has those multiple data points on it and is DKAN converting that into JSON or
I
is
think
it
it's a little simpler than you're imagining it. Like if I think probably if that's a data set, let's say a common sort of example is the tree data set. A lot of cities have a data set that's a list, a CFCB of all the trees that they know
okay.
of in the
Sure.
city. And it'll be, a lat long point and then
Mhm.
maybe like species, date it was
Sure.
planted, all that kind of thing. So the data set content in Drupal is not going to have anything at the tree level, that
Right.
it's going to say, maybe there's like a taxonomy of, this is streets data. And then potentially it could say, well, this is the geographic boundary of this data set. So it's only going to have maybe 4 or 5 points that say like, this is the extent described.
Mhm.
And the more, anything more detailed than that is in the file, which is it's just a,
Got it. So then
it's
somebody downloads the file to see the actual data points.
they download the file or, and we'll probably get to this in another, in a bit, or that file has been sort of ingested into the data store, which is one of the main components of DKAN, and they can query it directly with the API.
Got it. Okay. And then at that point, is that data in JSON format?
Yeah, the API, you can request the data as JSON or CSV.
Got it. Okay. So you wouldn't necessarily edit the data directly in with DKAN. That the data is provided to DKAN as a file or some other method.
Correct. Yeah.
Got it. Got it.
Yeah,
But the
that
metadata for the file is editable through
exactly.
DKAN. Got
Yes.
it.
Yeah.
Okay. Whew. All right. We made it. So going back to kind of DKAN and Drupal, and we talked about it being a distribution. You alluded a little bit to it kind of coming back to Drupal.org. I noticed when I was researching for the show that the module looks like it's currently hosted on GitHub instead of Drupal.org. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why that is and then like how you kind of plan to bring it back to Drupal.org, if I understood you correctly.
Absolutely. Yeah. So when we first released DKAN, and I wasn't quite on board yet, but I would say a big reason is in those days, this was kind of the beginning of civic tech and the beginning of GitHub. And all these hackathons were happening and people were, staying up all night in City Hall and writing little Ruby applications and posting them. GitHub was like the cool place to be if you were doing civic tech. That was one thing. And so the people doing this said like, well, let's just put it on GitHub, see what people think. Also, it had a lot of JavaScript in it. And because package management was not really there yet, the JavaScript was like in the module and it didn't work with the licensing rules on Drupal.org. So I think that probably would have been solvable, but we kind of just got used to, honestly, to working in GitHub, and it kind of stayed there for a long time. But that's kind of been not working so great lately. I mean, it does work to add it. I mean, obviously it works. That's how we've been doing it this whole time, to just add it, through a composer file. It's published on Packagist. But, I think Steve noticed this, that when he tried to publish a submodule or another module that depended on DKAN and Drupal.org, it caused all these problems because it wasn't in the Drupal.org registry. We also had some submodules that had naming conflicts with modules that were already on Drupal.org. And we just decided we really need to sort of be where the community is at. I think that time where GitHub mattered has kind of passed. The tooling on Drupal.org is there now. We didn't have CI pipelines and all this stuff that we were pretty early adopters of, that we said, well, we got to use GitHub if we want that stuff. So all that stuff is there. And, we want to make it easier to use and compose with other things. So we're just at the tail end of a pretty, honestly, arduous process of renaming a number of the submodules, which is way harder than it. Maybe it's not harder than it sounds, because you're nodding like you know exactly how hard that sounds. And that's required. We're actually jumping 2 major versions, because you're going to need to in order to sort of enable new modules and disable the old ones and then remove them from the code base, it's a pretty, you can't do it in the wrong order. So Drupal 4, sorry, I always do this, two big D words in my life. DKAN 4 will release on Drupal.org pretty soon. There's a dev branch up there already, and we're working out, some of the stuff with the packaging and, and all that stuff. But I expect, within weeks that we'll have at least a release candidate up there.
Great. We're excited to have you back. I imagine like Composer probably makes it a lot easier to include like some external libraries and stuff like that and bring that stuff all together, right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, all that stuff is solved. There's a lot, we have a lot, and I mean, most DKAN sites have a job like a React front end. So, they've got an npm file. They might be pulling in, there's all kinds of things that work pretty well. And for a lot of things, it doesn't really matter that DKAN wasn't on Drupal.org, but there's enough, it creates enough hurdles that we thought it was worth moving.
Yeah, one, I also think this, like, being on Drupal.org, we're going to be exposed to more people who want to take a look at it and either use it or contribute to it. Like, that's been another challenge, frankly, being on GitHub, is like having to do like our own big marketing push around it, and being a part, like, it just, frankly, it just makes more sense to be on Drupal.org, especially now. And I've been really excited that we're almost there. And I think it just makes sense, and there'll be a huge benefit lift to doing it across the board.
Just a side note for our current DKAN fans, anybody new, trying DKAN for the first time will be able to jump directly into DKAN 4 from Drupal.org. Anybody that's currently on DKAN 2 will have to update to like the newest version of DKAN 2, and then update to DKAN 3, and then update to DKAN 4, and have to do it in those hops to get configuration and everything else to play nicely.
I don't want to turn this into a negative, but it sounds like you're doing your own Drupal 7 to 8 migration there.
Almost.
Oh, I mean, the funny thing is that the code is all the same, and sort of like the test is, does it work exactly the same as it did before? So in that, in some ways it's nothing like that, but it is in some ways it is.
It's okay, Dan. It's okay, Dan. You could just tell me I'm wrong. Like, no, don't call it that.
Well, it's just that 7 to 8 upgrade had so many specific things that I'm still a little traumatized by, that I'm like,
but aren't we all?
Yeah, but it is like that in the sense that there's a lot of update hooks that need to run in a very specific order to get where you're going.
Dan, earlier on, you were talking about the process of ingesting a data set. It sounds like maybe DKAN performs some ETL processes in there. So what is the typical life cycle of a data set in DKAN?
So yeah, ETL is stands for extract, transform, load. It's kind of a data engineering term that definitely applies to two major things in DKAN. So I'll start with what we call the harvest. There's a few ways to get a data set into DKAN. One is just a post to the API, or a submission of the data set form. That gets one of them in there. Or you can point it at another catalog, or a JSON file that describes a lot of data sets at once, and have it harvest that. And that's not our word. That's kind of a standard in the data portal or data cataloging industry or something. So if you're using a harvest, it goes through. I mean, it's called ETL in the code. It goes through the extract, which is, there's kind of a guzzle to the URL of that JSON file. It's a very flexible system, so you can point it at another extract class that could parse the XML file and transform it. That's the next step into something that you can ingest. But it grabs your records from the external source, munges them into JSON that looks like your schema, and then loads it into dataset entities. The second side of it is the data itself. If you're ingesting or importing a CSV file into the data store system, that's going to be triggered sort of automatically when you load a data set, no matter how you do it, whether it's a API or a save. If DKAN sort of sees a URL to a CSV file, it's going to kick off a process where if it's a remote file, it's going to make a local copy. It's going to parse that all into a database table and then expose that to the API. So that's got a little bit less of a transform aspect to it, but it definitely extracts and loads the CSV. Excuse me. I could go into a lot of detail about that second process. That's where a lot of our engineering time goes these days, is to refining that.
What integrations or APIs make DKAN attractive for organizations that want to connect their data catalogs with other tools or platforms?
I mean, I'd say the DKAN API, it has a bunch of endpoints for the metadata and a bunch of endpoints for the data itself. And, being able to get at all of that in a really sort of straightforward, simple way, well, simple for an API, kind of makes the possibilities endless for third-party applications. So, we see a lot of visualizations built because they can, use any kind of charting library, build a query with the API. Maybe it needs to find the right data set using the metadata API and then build this query. There's all kinds of things that you can do that, that the API empowers. And then, there's integrations with other services that we talked about when we were talking about the Drupal ecosystem.
John, you're muted.
John, you're on mute.
All right, let's try again. Is that something like talking about APIs and integrations? Like, is that something you do use like Tableau for? Like, do you see a lot of folks using like pulling data and using it in that way, or like what kind of, I guess, charting libraries are you guys seeing people use?
We've
Well,
seen. I can speak to some of the more recent use cases that we've seen people use. So there's now it's falling out of my brain, but was it Real Charts and Reviz are two of the
Reviz and
are two of those. I've asked the same question about Tableau. Like I think that I think I've seen in previous lives a lot of interest in Tableau for either internal use or sometimes, having it on that, public dashboard to be like, here's all the data. Ed worked on a project where it was shelter animal data that they were presenting on a Tableau. Dan, I'll let you jump in because you had something else to add there as well.
Yeah, well, I think one thing is we can talk about the things that we've used to build applications on top of DKAN, which is, these kind of charting libraries we mentioned, as Recharts, D3 and Vega and all these things that we've either deployed or at least experimented with. We don't really, we don't know, like if someone pulls data from the API, we can't really tell what it is or what they're doing with it.
Right.
This is maybe a whole can of worms. We're definitely seeing things that are pretty clearly, all kinds of bots probably being driven by various AI agents, just kind of going through the data, and who knows what they're doing with it. So that's like, I think, going to be a challenge in the future, just on the infrastructure side, as how to deal with that, and continue to provide the make the data available to whoever wants it without just having your servers falling over every day. We're not there yet, but there have been there are some worrying signs.
So as we come to a close here, Liz, I'm wondering, looking ahead, like what do you see on the roadmap for DKAN, and like how do you see it evolving kind of alongside the broader Drupal ecosystem?
Yeah. So, for the past 18 months, there's been this big focus on like, cleaning up old code and fixing technical issues so we can start adding new features. Right now, as Dan mentioned, we're working on upgrading to DKAN 4 and getting everything on Drupal.org. Some next stuff, we've got a bunch of exciting things here. So like we're looking at implementing architectural changes to both the metadata model and the data store. So this will make many things, like not only are we addressing that, but this will make many things work better and integrate more smoothly with Drupal. We've got DKAN set up with a decoupled front end that uses APIs to display tables, and we're building a data table that doesn't rely on React. So like making things simpler and faster with that. So we want to be able to not have to rely on React. So that, if people don't have that set up, it's not required. We're also making the data store more flexible so it can work with different types of data and be easier to customize. And then we're working on a stored query system that will let users save and share reports for specific data sets. There's been a lot of interest in that with some of our projects that we've been working on. And then sort of down the road, this is on our radar, but we're being really thoughtful and cautious about it. We're, experimenting with AI and what problems it could solve. But like that's one that we've been sort of kicking the can a little bit. I think like we've got both AI curious people and skeptics within this group, which is a good, healthy balance of like, what are the, great use cases here in DKAN and how can we implement them intentionally?
Well, I mean, I think that's lends itself to a natural, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say like a natural use case for AI, right? Like, hey, look at my big data set and like, tell me like what commonality you see between this point, right?
Yep.
And being able to like get that back and have it go, well, we're seeing like this and okay, now graph it. Okay, now do this with it, do that with it. Like that seems like a natural evolution. So that is super interesting. Well, once you get that up and running, we'll have to have you guys back to talk more about it. Dan, anything on the roadmap that you're specifically excited about?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to get into because it requires getting way more in the weeds than people care about the internals. But I mean, these changes to the data store that we want to make, I'm really interested in maintaining this data store functionality but getting the tables out of the Drupal database. There's a lot of challenges with if you have bigger data sets or a lot of data sets, you can end up with, tens of gigabyte size Drupal database, even though it's only 2 megabytes of, CMS config data, and the rest is just these data tables. So I think for these sort of real world applications, it works fine to sort of demo the software to get stuff into the Drupal database, but we've been looking into both just having these kind of big data store tables in a separate database, maybe on the same infrastructure, but there's other technologies that are much more suited to what we're doing with these tables, which is kind of letting people run whatever queries that they want on them.
Yeah.
These sort of analytic database engines that just blow MySQL out of the water with their performance and even in their storage, efficiency. Right. So I'd love to be able to point the data store at something like that.
That sounds really cool.
And we're looking into that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I would say too, for anyone who's listening to this, if you're interested in DKAN, if you want to contribute, if you have ideas for future features or improvements, just let us know. Like, we're super happy to chat about it at any time.
And soon to be in the Drupal issue queue, right? You can drop a issue in the Drupal issue queue and you get right involved there. That sounds
well.
Awesome.
I want to be clear. Just want to clarify. For now, we're just publishing releases to Drupal.org. We're not quite ready to move. I think once the GitLab migration is complete and we can do issues in GitLab, it'll be easier to make the transition. But we are not just flipping. We're not just flipping the switch on the GitHub issues just yet. So do leave an issue in GitHub for now, but we will. but that's chapter 2 of the move to Drupal.org.
There you go.
We are on the list to get it converted to the GitLab issues when that continues rolling.
Awesome. Well, Liz and Dan, thank you for joining us. It was great chatting with both of you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks. It's been great.
If you have questions or feedback, reach out to Talking Drupal on the socials with the handle Talking Drupal or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
Would you like to be a guest on Talking Drupal or our new show, TD Cafe? Click the guest request button in the sidebar at talkingdrupal.com.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/tdpromo.
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest hosts, show news, upcoming shows, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
Thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choose Become a Patron.
All right. Again, everyone, thanks for joining us. Liz, if folks wanted to get a hold of you to talk about DKAN or Civic Actions or anything else, how could they go about doing that?
All right. So you can go to getdkan.org. There's a contact us form on that. That'll ping us in Slack. You can also reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on there. Send me a message. You can add me as a contact as well, and I would be happy to connect.
Awesome. Dan, what about you?
Yeah, I'm DAFEDER on GitHub, on Drupal, on Blue Sky. You can find me on LinkedIn. Yeah, get in touch.
Awesome.
Oh, and also we do have a DKAN channel on the Drupal Slack, so love to see people there.
Fabulous.
Oh yeah, for sure. Dan and I are both active on that channel, so you can ping either of us.
Good deal. And we will have links to some of the DKAN stuff in the show notes for our listeners who are interested. Steve, what about you?
I'm Swirt on Drupal.org and Drupal Slack, and Steve Wirt at LinkedIn.
Martin, thanks for filling in today. Where can folks find you if they want to chat?
Folks can find me as Manclue on a variety of Drupal and social channels, or occasionally they can find blog posts by me on manclue.com.
And I'm John Picozzi. You can find me personally at picozzi.com, on social media and Drupal.org at John Picozzi, and you can find out about EPAM at epam.com.
Thanks all. If you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.
Have a good one, everyone.